Hi and welcome to ScIQ. More than any other time in recent memory, the US public are becoming more and more disengaged with science and less interested in learning about science and its processes and its place in our lives. However, there are some people who are fighting back to make science interesting again, and they're using any technology available to them to do that, including podcasting. So I have three incredible science podcasters with me in the studio today. We have Kaleigh Rogers, who joins us from Motherboard at Vice. She is the host, producer, and creator of Science Solved, which uncovers some of the world's greatest mysteries. And I can tell you, it's compelling stuff. I'm halfway through one of these mysteries about Pokemon, and I can't wait to get to the end. So as soon as we finish filming, that's what I'll be going and listening to.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Doug Parsons, who is the host and creator of America Adapts, which focuses on two truths, that climate change is real and that we must adapt to it. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And then finally, we have Devon Collins. Now, I've been on Devon's incredible podcast, Science Soapbox. He's 1/3 of the team of the podcast that runs out of Rockefeller University, focusing on science policy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, my first question is going to be about a quote from your podcast that I heard recently. And it was about a guy called John Snow, not that John Snow, but a scientist in the 1850s was working on the cholera epidemic, and he wasn't listened to, even though he came up with a really good solution, or he found out how cholera was spreading. And you said, this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds these days. How do we change people's minds? Why are facts not enough? We need to trust science and facts, even when they fly in the face of deeply held beliefs. Because when science solves a mystery, but no one cares, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. So tell me about why you made a statement like that, and why are you communicating science? Why do you think it's important?
Well, that, as I said sort of before the show, that's sort of as political as I get on the show, because I do like to keep it light and fun and sort of give people a bit of an escape into enjoying the wonders of science in the world. But it was just so striking to hear this story from the 1850s, and you look at the map that John Snow created, and with all the hindsight that we have, it looks so obvious, like, oh, it was the water. That's how it was spreading. And it was just so difficult for him to convince anybody, because they had this idea that it spread through the air, and they just didn't want to believe the evidence that was in front of them because they just thought that they knew better. And so it's really compelling. Like, there's always new arguments, and science is always advancing, and even scientists sometimes have to struggle with adapting to new evidence that goes against what we used to think, and being open-minded to changing views on things. And it can be frustrating sometimes, with different movements, the anti-vaxxer movement and different things. It doesn't matter what the evidence says because people's beliefs trump that. So I'm hoping that when people get engaged with science and get excited about science, they'll learn to trust science a little more and get more involved in the process.
So by creating a love of science and an interest in science, they'll then trust science as a good policy making.
Yeah, and they'll maybe want to learn more. I think, it's fun doing my show because I get to talk about the process behind the investigation and show that, scientists aren't just making this up or guessing. There's a very rigorous process that they go through, and peer review and all these things that not everybody knows about. If you're not involved in the sciences, you might not realize all these steps that go into it, and you just see a headline and think, well, who made that study up? I don't know if I believe it. So the more,
seen that a few times.
Yeah. So the more engaged you are with it, and the more you understand the process behind it, the more likely I think you are to trust it and to be thinking critically about it in a way that's helpful.
Yeah. Doug, I want to ask you about the name of your podcast. Now, you called your podcast America Adapts. It's the Climate Change Adaptation podcast. Isn't that defeatist? Have we given up on solving climate change?
Well, that comes up quite a bit in the podcast. If you already jump into adapting to climate change, does that mean we can't solve the problem? And that's not it at all. We have to say that over and over again on the podcast. We need the people on the carbon emission side of things to keep doing what they're doing, the Paris Agreement, all those things. Please keep it up. But no matter what we do, there's still some warming baked in for the next 100 years, next 500 years. How is society going to... Right.
Baked in.
It's baked in. Nothing we can do. We just want to make sure it doesn't go too high. We want it to, be manageable. And so the conversations I have on the podcast are people are dealing with that. Sea level rise, drought. How are we going to adjust over the next 50 years? It's not even 50 years. It's in the next year. Things are already happening. And so there's actually a lot of efforts already underway. And that's what the podcast explores. What's already happening, and then getting people to speculate what will happen in 25 years, what will happen in 50 years.
Now, Devon, I was on your podcast, and as I was walking into the room, one of your co-hosts, Avatar Percha, said, there's not a lot of podcasts about science and policy. Why do you think it is the case, and why are you doing your podcast about science policy?
We think about this a lot. Part of the reason that we started Science Soapbox is that we, as scientists, felt woefully unprepared to engage with policymakers. And I think that's because we sort of see ourselves as very agnostic and unconcerned with governance and kind of the social sphere. And that makes us kind of shy away from, talking to politicians, talking to lawmakers and people like that. It's rough.
It's tough out there.
Yeah.
So you've all made different podcasts, but all with the aim of bringing science ideas to people who aren't scientists. Why is that important in this day and age?
Well, scientists are so boring. I still go to conferences, and just 75% of the presentations are these awful graphs. And these are conferences that different people are showing up to these presentations. It's just not people exactly in your field. And so you need to present the information in a way that they can absorb and it's going to resonate. And to this day, even though we all complain, they fall back into I'm going to put up these slides and these charts. And I think what we're trying to do with our podcast is demystify the science, and we're sort of a gateway into making these things very interesting. But scientists have a long way to go. They're still very boring.
I think that a lot of people, too, their only engagement with science is their 9th grade chem class, and ever since then they're just like, this is boring and nerdy.
I was one of those people who hated 9th grade chem.
Yeah, so then the thing is, as a science journalist, I'm coming across these studies, I'm reading all these things, and I'm like, science is so interesting, and it's everything. Every topic is touched by science. We're investigating constantly. And so if you can find a way to convince people that it is really exciting and interesting and it impacts their lives, then I think that that's only going to benefit them.
You said if you can find a way. Why is podcasting the way? Why is podcasting your medium? And I note the irony that we're talking about podcasting on YouTube, which is a video platform. So why podcasting? What made you choose that platform over any other?
I think Science Soapbox was started by 3 working scientists, and we needed something that was a little bit of a low barrier to entry, right? So we could have the biggest reach that we could get without having to. We record in the basement of our research building, and we can go back to our experiments right away. So it seemed like something very fast and relatively easy, although I think I don't know what my my fellow panel members will think about that.
You say it's easy and then oof, you're doing it wrong.
Well, we also didn't have the technical expertise for a video medium, and we thought that an audio medium would be really great for us.
And I think a lot of it depends on the host, but it's a chance for some of these experts to let their hair down, and depending on how long you're talking to these people. I talk for 45 minutes to an hour, and it takes a little bit of time where you're establishing chemistry with your guest, and you're getting them, and you can do follow-up questions that you're not getting out of PowerPoint presentations and those things. And so a podcast it just lends itself to a richer conversation, and thank goodness people have long commutes, because that's where I think they're all listening to the podcast, right?
Yeah.
No, and I think, I'm a science journalist by day, so I'm writing stories, and I hope people are reading those, but there's just something nice about having this intimate audio experience. We're kind of having this renaissance of audio storytelling, so people are willing to give it a shot, and it's just such a rich way of presenting these stories and really having people embed themselves in it.
If I may quote just some, I hear this from my listeners in this intimate notion. People have written to me, and they feel like they're sitting there on the couch with me having this conversation with my guest, and when they describe it that way, that's very satisfying.
Yeah, I think it's, I was talking about getting back to my experiments, and I've realized in the past year, so I've stopped listening to music, which I always did before, and I exclusively listen to podcasts while I'm working. And it's funny because I get home and I think, I'm so tired of talking to people. Wait a minute. I was pipetting and listening to a podcast. I wasn't talking to anybody today. So it is really you're right there in the studio with the people making the podcast, and I think that's really special.
It's really interesting coming from you as well, because your podcast is part of Motherboard, which is part of Vice, which was originally a print publication.
Yeah.
So why the decision to bring podcasting into the mix of all the media that is part of the Vice empire?
I mean, Vice is very open to experimentation and lets us sort of be creative and try things. And we had a couple podcasts. Motherboard had the first podcast, Radio Motherboard, and for Vice. And so we were sort of building off of that, and I just had an idea, and I pitched it, and they were willing to give it a shot, and they gave me a producer to work on it, and it ended up doing pretty well. So
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, Vice is just trying to come at all fronts any way we can, so.
Yeah, which we need to do in this day and age. I want to talk a bit more about that, about the fragmentation of the media, not just across different styles of media. So now we've got video is a way of communicating that wasn't possible 20 years ago to communicate via video on the internet. We've got also fragmentation of the news. And do you consider yourselves science journalists? And if you do, how does that affect the way that you are reporting or communicating with people? Because it's your own platform, so you could do and say whatever you like.
Well, my background is in science and policy, and I didn't consider myself a journalist for the first 6 months I was doing it, but then I was invited to come cover a conference, and they gave me a media pass. And then that happened more and more. I've probably been to a half a dozen conferences where I get these free registrations to go as a journalist, and so people started calling me a journalist, which was quite odd to consider yourself such a thing. And, you feel a certain responsibility, but it sort of happened naturally because people are just looking to you. You're, again, a gateway into this sort of information. So I didn't consider myself a journalist. People just kind of thrust it on you. So.
How does that affect your ethics as a reporter or as a journalist on what you're saying on your podcast?
Well, my background is journalism. I'm a reporter by day.
You are a journalist.
I am a journalist. So I do try to bring that. I think it can be tempting with these new formats because it's a little more creative and a little more loose to be editorializing a bit and maybe bringing your own opinion into it. So I have to be very careful that I'm being objective and just presenting the facts while still having fun with it and maybe winking to certain things.
I'm gonna go off course a little bit, Rusty. I don't think that what I do is journalism. I mean, it's also kind of baked into the name. Soapbox is in the name of our podcast. So I think we're kind of editorializing by design. And in fact, I think we were told by some early advisors, like, just go for it and say what you feel. We might end up kind of getting pushed into the world of journalism a little bit more, but I really think we're more entertainers than we are. Well, hopefully we're entertainers. Right? Yeah.
I think there's a mix of the two, though. I forgot what this issue was, but I've had journalists on the podcast, and I remember having a question about, journalistic integrity, and I gave this guy a phone call. He's a journalist down in Miami, Tristan Corton, and he did a big story on climate denial in Florida, and I had some questions, like, what should I be doing? But at the same time, we are entertainers, and, we're podcasters, and I want to bring my voice to my podcast, and there's a certain responsibility to that. But at the same time, I don't want to hide it and just become just oatmeal, It's like people want you to speak out. Hopefully you're not an idiot. So.
Yeah. No, and I think there is room. I think podcasts can be more open to opinions and to having a sort of thesis that you're driving home. And I think that's totally fair. Just for me, because I'm also writing news stories during the day, I feel like I've got to try and keep that balance. But in podcasts in general and in science podcasts, I think there's definitely room for a little more of a voice coming to it.
It seems like a spectrum from clear journalism to we're just a soapbox.
PhD.
Now, I want to talk a bit about that because you've had guests like John Holdren on your show. Now, he was a science advisor to President Obama and had some very interesting things to say about the current administration. So where do you join the line between entertainment, between presenting the facts, but also how do you guide yourself as where is too far?
Thankfully, we haven't gotten to anything that feels like too far. And when developing the podcast, we were trying to figure out, again, kind of relating to what we were just talking about, where do we go, right? Are we going to try? We're not trying to be gotcha, very gotcha journalists. We're not journalists, but it was, we want to talk to people who are not necessarily going to agree with us. And we've had a few guests with whom we've had disagreements. And I'm not really sure. I actually don't know. It's a little bit of a tough question. We don't really have a prescribed process, right? But I think that our guiding principle is having an interesting conversation, and if there are disagreements that arise out of that, then we try to unpack those as well as we can, because we are kind of, within territory where there are going to be disagreements, there are going to be competing interests, and highlighting those, I think, is our strength. So we try to stay with that.
I like that you said that there's some guests that you don't agree with, because I know, Doug, you've interviewed a couple of people that you would never suspect would be on a climate change adaptation podcast, including Mark Morano, who's one of the leading climate skeptics. What has been the response from your listeners when they've heard that this podcast is coming out? They're giving a platform to the skeptics, and why do you do it?
Well, okay, and so Mark, I haven't published it yet, and so that's coming out very soon, but I did mention in a previous podcast, hey, these are my upcoming guests. I had Mark Morano, Pat Michaels, who's a scientist at the Cato Institute, and I did hear from a listener that they were put off that I was going to have Mark Morano on and Pat Michaels because they're prominent climate skeptics, and they are also sort of on behalf of my other listeners, they're going to be put off by it, and my knee-jerk reaction was, I don't want to have the same predictable, boring conversations, and it's not like this person beats dogs for a living, I don't like what Mark Morano does. I think, some things he does are sketchy, but he goes on CNN, he goes on all these other platforms. I want my podcast to be a platform where my listeners are challenged mentally, that they're like, wow, okay. And that podcast, too, I wanted something to be learned from it. And so I actually had, we have common acquaintance, Randy Olson came onto that podcast, and he dissects my interview with Mark Morano, like what are the tactics that he uses, and we even did like a Myers-Briggs kind of analysis of it. And I want it to be actually a nice reference podcast for people like, what is a climate skeptic? Mm-hmm. And Mark, to his credit, was a lovely guest. I disagreed with everything that he said. He was dropping studies left and right that wouldn't pass the, toilet test, but it was perfectly lovely conversation, and that's just the style I run, and so I'm looking forward to the feedback on that episode.
I think when there's prominent climate skeptics out there going on CNN, you can't just pretend they don't exist and hope they go away. Yeah. I think this is a really interesting way to approach it and actually engage, see how they're trying to form their arguments, what their motivation is, and kind of picking that apart a little bit.
Yeah.
That was a whole part of the conversation. What is his motivation? Mm-hmm. And then this discussion with Randy, what is his motivation? And so your point, though, going on CNN, they go on for 5 minutes, and it's just 5 minutes of that. Mm-hmm. This is a 45-minute conversation. Yeah. There's some substance there, I hope. So.
Yeah, I think we try to provide a context for where our guests are working, and we actually also on our podcast had a very accomplished person who is also a very staunch climate change denier and skeptic. I think that's a better word. And before the interview, he sent us this like white paper, these white papers he had written, and with our cursory climate science knowledge, we came to the opposite conclusion of the entire thesis of this white paper. And so we thought it was really, and we haven't aired this part of the conversation yet, but we thought it was really important, and speaking of being like responsible to our listeners, we thought it was really important to put that conversation out there and talk about how, well, we went through this stuff, and you can kind of come up with any solution you want to this problem, but which one is the right one, and how do you tease apart what is, kind of baloney from what's actually true? And yeah, we wanted to really highlight those disagreements in this conversation,
Teasing apart the process is something that you specifically set out to do on your podcast, Kaleigh. And I've been really interested listening because you cover all sorts of topics from Pokemon to ghost trees to ancient markings and why they're there, to cholera outbreaks. How do you choose your topics? And has the current administration or the political scene that we find ourselves in, has that affected the way that you do your show?
No. Well, because mine is so motivated by such a kind of narrow topic in a way, which is the mysteries that have been solved. And I really prefer mysteries that a lot of people think has some kind of mystical or, otherworldly or paranormal explanation, because for me, when I find out real explanation, the scientific explanation that they've uncovered, that's always so much more exciting to me than like, it was a ghost did it. You know, I want to know what actually happened, and it's always these amazing, you know, phenomena of nature and powerful things and forces in our universe that do exist, and that's way more exciting for me than just like guessing that it's aliens or something.
Yeah. I love that you actually make a point of leading the viewer or the listener on a journey from like, everyone thought it was this, but it's not, and we're not going to tell you what it is until after the break.
I try to do that. Yeah, it's funny talking about, you know, this sort of balance, and I haven't really done. I was close to doing an interview. So when I talk about sort of the paranormal theories, I usually talk to the scientist who uncovered it or some kind of cultural expert who knows about it but maybe didn't personally believe in it. And I've had some trouble with that. Some listeners actually responded and were like, you know, you don't have to make so much fun of these like alternative ideas. Like, you can just present them without scoffing so much, which is like a fair criticism probably, but sometimes they're just so ridiculous. It's hard for me to resist. But yeah, I sometimes wonder if I should have someone on that truly believes that it's acoustic levitation or something that's causing these rocks to move, and let them say their piece, and then I can move on to be like, well, actually, science doesn't bear that out. But
yeah. Now, for people who are thinking about, look, I really love what you're doing. I'd love to do my own podcast because I've got a topic that hasn't been covered yet, and I think I want to get out there and do it. Do you have any advice for, you're all at different stages in your podcasting careers and doing it in different ways? What would be your advice to people who are out there thinking about starting their own podcast?
If you're serious, set a date and do it. That's it. I don't know if you've been, but going to a podcast conference, it's really an incredible experience. And the podcast culture really is supportive. You want, even if you're in the same ecosystem of topics, you help each other out. And so I would encourage people, if they're at all serious, to do it. There's a low entry cost to do most podcasts. And so I would encourage it because, I mean, if you make it successful, and that doesn't even mean you have a lot of listeners, but you're out there and you're speaking to this topic, you're going to have a blast. You're going to really enjoy it, be it science, be it any popular culture. You know, it's a fun thing. And then when you get even a little bit of a listener base, it's just, I encourage you to just step up and do it. And don't think you're going to be the next Mark Maron or anything. That's not going to happen. Your growth, unless you're starting at NPR, will be like that if you're any good, you know? And maybe you're not any good, and then you'll stop doing it.
Yeah. I would say listen to as many different kinds of podcasts as possible. If you're not like a heavy podcast listener, you're not going to know like the trends and the vibes and the cadence that people use and the different, you know, styles that you can try. So if you want to start a podcast and you don't listen to podcasts right now, you should listen to as many as you can and just sort of binge listen for a while and get a sense of what's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I just have to second what both of you have said. Just do it and figure out what your voice is. And I think for us, it was really important to identify what we wanted to see and a lack that we perceived and try to fill it. And it's worked so far.
Now, you mentioned the trends. What do you think are the trends in podcasting? Where is the future of science podcasting?
I think it's all different. So like ours, you know, we do a lot of like sound editing and sound storytelling with our podcast, and you know, it's sort of a lighter version of Radiolab is where my inspiration comes from, because they're obviously talking about really scientific topics, and that sound design really helps bring it to life. I think some of these are difficult to explain or describe, and sometimes I wish I was on video so I could just show them like the rocks that are moving, and instead I have to try and paint this picture with my voice. So I think that the sound design really helps, and Radiolab, like, you know, was the pioneers there, so.
Yeah.
I could do two quickly. One is more of the podcast culture in general, is that Google and Android needs to make a native app for podcast, and so that...
You're in YouTube Studio.
I know, please, Google, you need to do that. It would increase listenership tremendously. And then second, I guess, in science podcasting, I'm trying to encourage, I'm shocked that more like conservation groups and NGOs don't have a podcast. They don't need to pretend that they're going to grow into some massive thing, but to engage with their members. The newsletter stinks, you know, where people like, 5% of people read these newsletters that go out. The podcast is a huge opportunity to really connect. You know, you're a large wildlife conservation group. I'm trying to encourage that now. It's just like, get a podcast, doesn't cost a lot, and that's what I hope a trend will be.
Yeah, I'm thinking, especially in this political climate, there seems to be a push more for scientists as advocacy, person. That was a terrible way to say it, but advocate, it's what I'm trying to say. I think that, especially, Doug, to your point about NGOs and different, nonpartisan and non-political groups, kind of really pushing their science, pushing their story, and pushing their viewpoints to combat this sort of anti-scientific culture that we find ourselves in now.
I want you each to tell me your favorite episode that you've ever created and why it's your favorite. You all your eyes went.
Back. My favorite is, we've only done one season, so I've got a smaller body to look through here, but we did a story about the Marfa Lights, which are in Texas, and they're these mysterious, weird floating lights out in the desert. But I really liked that one because I spoke with a journalist there who had written about them, and he was so romantic about it. It was really sweet, even though he knew the scientific explanation that they weren't paranormal. He just had such a fondness for that area of Texas and the fact that people come and look at them and the sort of the communal feeling about it. It was really lovely.
The guests make it all worthwhile.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I have to say too, first on, I do quickly, I was sponsored to go to Uganda and talk about adaptation with developing countries. It was really special to go talk to people in Africa, and people from Asia came to this. It was just a fabulous experience, and I really feel this is a great resource out there. But another earlier episode, I had that reporter on from Florida who broke that story, the Florida governor bans climate change. And what was fun for me is I was actually part of that story. I was interviewed for the original story, and so the podcast kind of went back and forth where he was asking me questions and I was asking him questions, and that was just a lot of fun. So,
I also have to say too, our latest episode was with a longtime friend of ours, friend of the podcast. Her name is Sabria Stukes, and
She has been on this panel before.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool. We had the best conversation ever, just unpacking what it means to be a PhD and what you can do with that, the promises that are made to us as bench scientists and how those are broken and how they're fulfilled. And it ended up being a really great episode. And then my personal favorite is an interview we did with a woman named Marnie Gilbert, who's working with this human genome education, not panel, but group. And she talks about how she engages with communities that have been traditionally mistrusting of science and scientists, and how the work that she does to build bridges between us and them, engaging with community leaders, faith leaders, especially in communities of historically disadvantaged minorities, especially African Americans, and it's just really beautiful the way that she goes in without taking anything. She doesn't collect data. She just wants to talk and educate and learn from the people she's talking to. It's really wonderful.
Now, if we want to listen to that episode or any others on Science Soapbox, and you should all listen to my episode on Science Soapbox, of course, where can we find it?
You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, Science Soapbox. You can also find us on Twitter at science_soapbox and sciencesoapbox.org.
Doug, where can we find America Adapts?
iTunes, so search for America Adapts or climate change. It should show up toward the top. Consuming podcasts is more difficult than it should be. And then my website is americaadapts.org, and you can play straight from the website.
And Kaleigh, how's science solving it?
Yeah, Science Solved It. We're on Twitter at Science Solved It. We're on Stitcher and iTunes and all of those good platforms. And then you can also go to motherboard.vice.com. We always post our episodes there and have stories that go along with them and photos and a little extra stuff.
And I love your website too, because if you like spoilers like I do, you've got the outline of the episode on there.
True, yeah.
So if you can't handle waiting for the mystery, you can read ahead.
Our very first episode, we didn't put the reveal in the body of the text, and people were so mad. I was like, we gotta just reveal it. We gotta spoil it. Because people are like, I'm not listening to this now. I just want to know what the answer is.
So definitely check them all out. They're all covering different elements of science that are super important. Thank you all for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Hi everyone, I'm Jade Lovell, resident science nerd on the Young Turks Network. You're watching ScIQ, and we know you don't want to miss an episode, so please click the subscribe button down below.